Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In this walkthrough, I'm going to show you how to use the serverless framework with AWS in order to create a streamlined CI/CD process that is really quick. I'm going to show you start to finish, so let's just get into it. All right, so the first thing that you want to do is you want to make sure you have Node.js downloaded. You probably have it installed for previous projects if you're watching this video, but if you do not, that is a prerequisite that you need. I have Mac, so I downloaded the Mac version, but if you have Windows, please download the Windows version. So after you have Node installed, go ahead and do a node -- version, and you should see what version of Node you're running. The version doesn't really matter for this tutorial. I'm running 20.5.1, that should be fine. The serverless documentation is going to be your best friend, so make sure you go to it. And if we go over to the Get Started screen, we go to Setup, you can see the first command that we need to run is npm install -g serverless. What this does is it installs the serverless node package globally on your computer. So it doesn't matter what directory you're in. You can go ahead, paste that right in there, and then press enter. So now that we have the Node serverless package on our machine, we can go ahead and create a serverless project. So go in the directory that you want. Mine is cd source/repos. So now that we're here, we're going to create our serverless project. And so all you need to do that is go serverless, enter. Now it's going to walk you through a bunch of configuration steps that you need to do. So the first one is what kind of serverless project do you want to have? These are templates. Templates help you start your project. If you have a template that you know of that's not on here and you have the URL of it, you can go ahead and click other and do that. But for this video, we're just going to create a HTTP API Python. We will just call it serverless tutorial. And now it's downloading the template from the web. It asks us if we want to register or log into the serverless framework website. Let's just do no. You can do that if you want. There's no really reason why we need to do that in this tutorial. Do you want to deploy now? We're going to go ahead and say no. You can if you want. If you don't have your AWS CLI configured, which we're going to do in the next step, it won't work. You need to have access to a AWS account in order to deploy to AWS. So we're going to say no, we're not going to deploy. From here, let's open Visual Studio and let's look at the serverless project. We will do a cd serverless tutorial, and then I will do a code period. That will open up Visual Studio. So now that you have Visual Studio up, you should see 4 files: your classic gitignore, your handle.py, your readme, and your serverless. The coolest thing about the serverless project is you can define a lot of functionality and not that much files. So looking at the first file, we have the .gitignore. This is just a list of files that GitHub should ignore and not track. We have our handle.py. This is our actual function that will be run as a Lambda. So you can think of your Python files as your lambdas. Your README, this is the default README that serverless provides. We can go look at the documentation here. It has some good instructions on how to work with your serverless project, but we're going to ignore that and we're just going to go ahead and delete it. Actually, it's not needed. And then we've got our serverless.yaml file. So the name of this file is important. We don't want to change that name. When you type serverless to deploy it, it looks at this file to deploy. You can see this is code as infrastructure. And so when serverless runs, it will build the Lambda functions that you describe here. It says what provider you are, what runtime you're using. You can see the runtime here. That is Python 3.9. And that's what the default Python HTTP API template gives us. We will change this to 3.11. The framework version, don't worry about that. That's just for serverless. Just take what it gives you. And then here's the name that we named our project. The function, it maps our API gateway in AWS directly to the Lambda. If you don't know what I mean by that, fast forward or watch the rest of this video and I'll explain that. The next thing we need to do is we need to install the AWS CLI if you don't already, because serverless piggybacks off of the AWS CLI credentials in order to access your AWS account. The serverless project is nothing if it's not connected to an AWS account to actually do the work of deploying the infrastructure. So if you go to this website right here, you should see instructions from AWS on how to install the latest version of the CLI. Go ahead and click whatever OS you're running. I'm running Mac OS, for example, and then I'd come down here and I would follow the steps. I'm not going to explain how to do that because that's not the point of this video. So go ahead and install the CLI, then come back. All right, so assuming that you have the CLI downloaded and installed, you should be able to do AWS. And you should see this as a response. This means, yay, you successfully downloaded it. You also should be able to do an AWS configure. So when you type in AWS configure, it'll then prompt you to enter certain keys and secrets. This is the way of connecting your CLI to your actual AWS account. You can see I already have mine pre-filled. Yours will not if you have just installed AWS. It'll ask you for the AWS access key ID, the secret access key, the default region, and any output format that you desire, and that'll be that. And then once you do that, make sure you go ahead, restart your shell environment, and then you should be connected. And so you should be able to go, for instance, AWS S3LS. So if you're here and you get a response, good, that means you're connected. In fact, if you don't get anything, it still is okay. That means you're connected. You just don't have any buckets. I do have one bucket. You can see I was doing some training for Snowflake, and so that's in there, obviously. To get a token, an access key, so you can connect your CLI to your AWS account, head over to IAM. I am on my IAM admin. This is my admin user. And then go down to users, click on your user that you want to use for the access token, and go to security credentials, scroll down until you see access keys, and here are your access keys. I have 2 access keys, you may have 0. If that's the case, you need to create an access key and then keep track of the secret and the key ID. And then that's what you will use to connect your CLI. So now that we have our AWS CLI downloaded, we have serverless downloaded, and we've created our serverless project, I'm going to go back into our project and I'm going to do a serverless deploy. And what this does is it takes the current code in your repository and it'll push it to AWS and build those resources. So it'll build your API gateway. It'll build some IAM role credentials. It will build some Lambdas, depending on what Lambdas are in there. And we'll go ahead and look at the creation stack. So if you head over to CloudFormation while that's being built, serverless uses CloudFormation to deploy all of the code, to deploy all of the resources. And so we can go into resources. We can see all the things that serverless is creating for us when we deploy. And it's all held in what's called a stack. CloudFormation uses stacks to logically keep reference of what physical resources are created. So we'll just keep on refreshing until we get it complete. There we go. It is complete. We can see all of the resources that have been created. It created our actual Lambda function, which just says hello, and we can see that handle hello. There's our function, and it created hello Lambda function. So that's using serverless deploy. One thing I will note that is very important if it's not working for you, your user must have the permissions to do everything that the stack is trying to do. So when serverless deploy occurs, it uses the permissions of the user that is logged in your AWS configure to then deploy. If that user does not have permissions for which the access key belongs to, then you will not be able to do this. And there will be some sort of error in this stack deployment. It'll say you don't have permissions to create a bucket, maybe, if you don't have S3 permissions to create a bucket. So congrats, we just deployed our first serverless application. We can go over to API Gateway. We can go to Dev Serverless Tutorial. We can see our get here. We have a get on the root of our domain, which we can see maps directly to our serverless file. On the root of our domain, we have a get method, and that get method should call our handler.hello. So here's handler, hello. And so it should return a body that says a message of this, but then also should just kind of boomerang back our event that we're passing to it. So if we go to the API we have here and we just click, there we go. We have a successful API. We are full stack, baby. We can do it. We can get to it. It's awesome. The next step that we're going to do is we're going to use CodeBuild and CodePipeline and GitHub to then create a CI/CD environment where we can make changes in our code, push it to GitHub, and then automatically our deployment happens. The first thing you need to do now is create a GitHub account if you don't have a GitHub account. If you have a GitHub account, and I please hope you have a GitHub account if you're watching this video, the next thing you need to do is create a repo and push all of your code to the repo. So I'm going to create a new repo, and I'm going to call it the same thing, serverless tutorial. And I'm going to keep it public. You can make it private. It's whatever. It's a tutorial. We're going to create the repo. The next thing you want to do, open up my terminal, and I'm going to do a git init. And then so that initializes GitHub, and then I'm going to do a git add period. And then to be quick, I'm going to copy and paste the rest of this there. So now we've pushed all of our code up to GitHub. If we refresh the page, we should see our code right here. So that's good. The next thing we want to do is we want to go to CodeBuild, and we need to create a build project. What a build project is, it is the actual upping of a new container of compute resource that allows you to run certain commands on a source. So if our source is our GitHub repository, that's our source of code, we can then up a temporary container, and you can run commands in that container kind of like it's a computer, and then you can do that building in that container. So let's build project. We'll say our project name is serverless tutorial build. We can accept default on pretty much the rest of this. We do have to tell it a source. Our source is going to be GitHub, and we're going to do a public repository. So we're just going to go over to our GitHub, and we're going to copy the URL. My part right here might look different than yours because I have already connected my personal GitHub. You can look up how to do that. We need to say the operating system that we want in this container. So we're going to say it Amazon Linux 2. We're going to say standard. All this runs in the free tier, so you don't have to worry about charges. We're going to use 5.0. This kind of does matter because it determines what Python version you are able to run. For 5.0, you can only run 3.11. For the other ones, you can run 3.9, I'm pretty sure. So we'll have to change that, but we'll stick with 5.0 for now. The image version, we don't care. We'll just use the latest image, and we'll use a default service role, and it's going to look for a build spec file. So on a code build, it will look for a build spec file called buildspec.yaml. You can see that right here. And then it'll build based off that. I'll explain when we make that. We're going to keep that default, create build project. So give it a second. All right. The next thing we need to do is we need to create a pipeline. So the build project's there, but it needs to know when to run. And so that's when the pipeline's going to happen. What the pipeline does is it will look at a source and monitor and see when it changes. And when it changes, it'll do something. So we'll go create pipeline. We'll say serverless tutorial pipeline. We're going to create a new service role. We're going to allow it to use, we're going to accept all the defaults there. Our source provider is going to be GitHub version 2. Make sure you click version 2. Now, the way this is going to work is you need to connect your GitHub. Okay, I know we didn't have to connect our GitHub for CodeBuild. I'm not too sure. Just connect your GitHub, follow the steps. It'll say connected to GitHub, and create a new connection. And I've created, looks like I need to create a new connection. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to create a new connection. I'm going to create a new connection name called serverless, and you can see my learning. That's okay. Serverless tutorial. We're going to connect to GitHub. And so we've got our connection name, and then we need to install a new app. Scroll down, and I could select all repositories. I'm only going to select the repository that I want. So I'm going to do serverless tutorial, save, and then I'm going to press connect. And then there we go. We can click on our specific repository name, which is the name of the GitHub repo that we created. We're going to do the branch, which is going to be main. And we want to start the pipeline on the source code change. So CodePipeline will look at your repository and detect a change. And once its change happens, then it'll run your build. And so we'll click next. Our build provider is going to be CodeBuild. The project name, serverless tutorial build, that's the only one. Our deployment provider, we don't want this. Serverless does all of our deployment for us, so we don't actually need an additional deployment device. So we'll just skip this stage. We'll create pipeline, and we'll give it a second as it builds the pipeline. And there we go. So it's gonna initially build once you create it, and it's gonna fail, and that's okay. Let's wait and watch it fail. So the source succeeded. It did recognize our GitHub repository. That's good. Our build step now gets kicked off because it detected a change, which there was not really a change detected, but it was simulated to just initialize this pipeline. We can go into the logs to see, and I want to show it fail. So it failed. And it fails with the message YAML file does not exist. That is expected because our repo needs to have a buildspec.yml file in the root of the folder. And as you can see right now, we don't have one. So head over to your VS Code, and we'll create a new file called buildspec.yml. And now we need to define certain things in this build spec file. So within this build spec file, you need to outline to AWS what you want to do in the code build stage. And so the first thing that you need to do is you need to specify the version of your build spec file. Just use 0.2. If you're watching this in the future, maybe there's a 0.3. Then in the build stage, there's multiple phases. So there's like a pre-install, there's an install, there's a build, and there's a post-build, or a pre-build maybe. What we're going to use first is the install. And now we need to install dependencies. Of course, we need to define the runtime version that we want to use. And we're going to use Python 3.11. And so because we're using 3.11 here, we need to change this to 3.11. After we define the Python runtime version, we need to say the commands that we want CodeBuild to execute. And we want to do an npm install --silent space -- no progress -g serverless. And what this does, it'll silently install serverless behind the scenes. We say silent so it doesn't log us all up with the command terminal with the logs. So this installs serverless just like we did on our local machine. That's really all the only dependencies we need. So we just have the Python and we have the install. Next is our build phase. And the build phase will take commands. Your commands are going to take up most of your build phase. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a simple echo to alert in our logs, hey, we're starting our serverless deployment. The next thing is we're going to do a serverless deploy, and we're going to do -- stage of $environment. And what the $ signifies, it's an environment variable on the container. So we will set the environment variables of environment and region right now. We will go over into our code build. We'll edit environment, additional configuration, and we'll say our environment is dev, and we will say our region is US East 1, and we'll update the environment. So now the container will have these values. We do a -- conceal, and what that'll do is it'll hide any secrets from outputting. If we have any, we won't in this tutorial, but it's always good to use that. And then -- verbose to give us a very detailed logging of what's going with each deployment step. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll do an echo finish deployment just to signify in our logs, hey, we're done. And that's all it is for our build spec. Now, if we go and commit, if we go over here and we do a git push, I just like to use this little side thing, and we'll say changes, and we'll push it. Let's hop over to our pipeline. We see it's failed, but it should kick off into an in progress state. So let's go ahead and refresh. We see in progress. Let's click on it and see what's going on. It successfully detected a change in our repository, and now it's moving on to the build step. And so let's look at the logs. Let's go to AWS CodeBuild. Let's go ahead and click into this one, and we can see our logs of the build step. So as you can see, it's running the npm install serverless. It's doing it silently, so we don't see any logs for that. Now you can see it's running the serverless deploy. We did this locally on our machine, but what it's doing now is it's actually doing it in the container. Okay, we got an error. And so let's see what this error is. This is great, and I wanted to fail on purpose because I want to show you how you debug. So let's go to CloudWatch. CodeBuild is linked by default to CloudWatch. And so you can go over and look at your log groups, and you can go into your serverless tutorial build, and we can go see the most recent stream and see where the error happened. So we see error. Let's open this up. And so it says, you are not authorized to perform certain things. Okay, so conceptually, here's what's happening. When we deployed by running the CLI command like this, and we said serverless deploy. When we ran this command, it uses the permissions of the person's access key on your machine. So you created an access key under a user that had the permissions to do things like create a bucket, create a CloudFormation stack, to create Lambdas. But now CodeBuild does not have those permissions. Out of the box, CodeBuild does not have any permissions. And you have to create a service role for that CodeBuild, and it'll use the permissions in that role to build things, to build all your resources. So we have to go add all the permissions that are needed by the serverless deploy in that CodeBuild role. So go over back to IAM, go to roles, and you should see one that says CodeBuild serverless tutorial build service role. The name of this, depending on what you named your project, I named mine serverless tutorial, but this is the one that I'm going to click on. And we can see in the policy that the CodeBuild container will only have permissions to do some logging stuff, to do some S3 stuff, but not create a bucket, which is something that's got to be able to do, and then some CodeBuild stuff. There are many permissions that this is going to need, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over cherry picking each of the policies that are needed. So what I'm going to do is, and I want you to do for the sake of this tutorial, just go ahead, click on administrator access. This is not good practice. I want to repeat that. This is not good practice, and you would never do this in an enterprise setting. This will give it all the permissions it needs. And just to make sure that we are editing the correct role, let's go into our project build. We'll go to the build details tab, and we'll scroll down until we see environment, and we'll see the service role here. And it is in fact the CodeBuild-serverless-tutorial-build-service role-role. So we did edit it correctly. Let's go ahead and manually simulate that we have a change in our GitHub bucket. So we're going to go ahead and restart the pipeline. It's going to check the source. For a change, it's simulating this part. Our build step is now in progress. We're going to go and view the logs. We can see again that the npm install for serverless is happening. Nothing's changed with that. Should work fine. We can see the deployment happening right now. It looks like it has all the permissions it needs because it's creating the change sets in CloudFormation. We see an update complete, cleanup in progress. That means we're successful. And we can see down here, we have our echo of finished deployment. We have finished the deployment. So we're successful. If we go ahead and refresh the screen, we should see the build is successful. It is successful. And then we're now deployed. So let's go over to our API. We'll say APIs. We'll click on our API. And let's go ahead again. It's there. We're still up and working, but we don't know any change. We didn't see the actual deployment, the benefit of deployment. Yeah, sure, we deployed again, but it was the same thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another Lambda function. So just go ahead and copy and paste the handler. Let's go and rename this to buy. And let's go and rename the handler here to hi. So we have two functions, hi and buy. And let's, for simplicity, let's go ahead and get rid of this event right here. And we'll just replace this and say hi. We'll throw an exclamation point there. And here we will get rid of this and say bye. We'll get rid of the event. And we will change in buy the function to be buy. In hi, we will change the function to say hi. So now we've got two functions, one saying hi, one saying bye. But we need to map those functions into our serverless file. So we can go ahead and change hello to hi. We'll change it here too, hi. Now it says handler.hi, but we changed the file name to hi as well. So we're going to have hi.hi, hi.hi. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to change the path to /hi. We can copy all of this and paste it right below. And we need to make sure our spacing's right because YAML is tab sensitive. And so you can see it's yelling at us. It's got to be unique. So we'll call this by. And for wherever there's a hi, we can do a command D and say by. And it's still a get method. So we made our changes, we created a new Lambda, and we want to update that in our AWS account. So go to source, I'm gonna say changes, and we're pushing our changes. Immediately what should happen, if we go over to our pipeline, we see that it's in progress. It detected the change, and it's gonna go ahead and build. We're gonna give it some time to build. And during the build, you can see it's creating all the new Lambdas and API gateway routes, and it's also deleting the old ones. So we no longer have the hello API and Lambda. We now have hi and bye right there. We'll refresh the screen, and you can see the build succeeded. So if we go over to our API gateway, we click on this, you can see we now have our two separate endpoints for hi and bye. If we click this, page not found. Well, we got to go to our specified route. So we'll say hi. And there we go. We get our message of hi. And we can go bye, and we can get our message of bye. Well, there you have it, folks. That's all I have for you. I hope this was inspiring. I hope you learned a little bit about CI/CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment. Now, all you have to do is make changes to your code and push your code to GitHub, and all the resources and infrastructure are built for you. That's the benefit of serverless in combination with AWS, Pipeline, and CodeBuild. Please give me a like. That would be awesome if you found this entertaining or educational at all. That helps me out a ton. And comment what you think. Comment if you want any videos on something similar like this, or comment if you have any problems and I can reach back out to you. Thanks.